Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Coldplay, titled Ghost Stories. You know, I think Coldplay have a worse reputation than they arguably deserve. Yes, they tend to get lumped into the category of silent majority acts, bands adored by the mainstream but generally viewed outside of the mainstream as making crowd-pleasing pablum. And yes, they've written more than their fair share of broadly sketched saccharine trifle. And yes, Chris Martin can be a preening, pretentious dick at points. But look, when you take a step back, away from all of that, is Coldplay really that bad of a band? Honestly, I don't think so. I'm not gonna thrash a band for being accessible if they make good music along the way. And you know what? I'd be hard pressed to deny that Coldplay has written some great melodies and some decent lyrics throughout the course of their career. I think part of the issue that a lot of people have with Coldplay is the undeserved hype behind that band. And I remember the push behind the act as the next big stadium rock act in the van of someone like U2. But while I can say with some degree of certainty that Coldplay puts on a great show, having seen them live in 2009 when they toured with Snow Patrol, a much better band, but they're playing in a different wheelhouse than a band like U2, in the instrumentation and especially in the songwriting. But around the mid to late 2000s, things started to shift up a little bit with Coldplay. They started working with Marcus Drabs and Brian Eno when they released their slightly more experimental, at least more diverse album, Viva La Vida, or Death and All His Friends, which remains my favorite Coldplay album for amping up their epic scope into something with some actual teeth and grit. They then tried for more of a concept album with Milo Xyloto, and while I'm still not really a fan of that album, I do respect the band for sticking with Eno and trying something a little bit more new. Granted, I couldn't take Chris Martin's bad pretensions behind asinine lyrics remotely seriously, and the autotune I still hold was completely unnecessary on that album, but I can't really call the album more than just kind of the slight misfire than it was. It wasn't that bad. But when I started hearing the first singles from Coldplay's newest album, Ghost Stories, I was immediately worried. Not only did they seem softer and weaker than ever, they also seem to be opting for a drearier, more ambient tone, the same sort that's been smothering indie rock like a plague for over the past year. In other words, I had nothing but bad feelings going into this record, and I just thought I wasn't going to enjoy it. Was I wrong? Well, not quite. Look, I'll admit that this album, it's not bad, but you know what? It was exactly what I was expecting. And to tell you the truth, I've been really struggling with this review the entire week because this album raises so little of a reaction from me. Not good, not bad, not anything. Which means that likely this review will be a little bit shorter, but also means that Ghost Stories by Coldplay isn't really going to get a recommendation. What's most frustrating about this album is that I can see what they were trying to do in terms of their sound and album concept, but in the end, the result is just not all that compelling to me. At all. So, okay, I guess the best place to start with this is the instrumentation, which is easily the most melancholy and mood-centric that Coldplay has been since X and Y. I wouldn't exactly call this record tightly composed, though. The tracks meander and all feel a little bit overlong and definitely could have deserved an editor, but the drum machines add a brittle framework over the record that does mostly give it a little bit of shape. In fact, if I were going to point out an area that at least has some definition, like it tends to happen in most modern indie rock, it'd be in the percussion, mostly because some of the melodies, they just feel hazy and aimless. At a few points build into a fraction of a crescendo or a decent slow burn, but never really exploding. In fact, if we're looking for a word to describe the overall instrumental momentum of this album, it'd be anticlimax. A very polished, well-produced brand of anticlimax, mind you, but at the end of most songs, I'm just left feeling distinctly dissatisfied. Now, that's not saying I don't like distinctive moments on these tracks. I like the acoustic transition and Magic. I like the slightly off-kilter guitar solo in True Love. I like the melodic progression of Another's Arms for its moody darkness. And following along in Kanye West's footsteps from 808s and Heartbreak, I really like the usage of pitch correction in Midnight to emphasize that feeling of loneliness and darkness. I really like that. But for all of these pretensions to minimalism, the mix of these songs feel littered with extraneous effects and layers that don't really add anything to these songs and take away from the songs I like. And the deft touch of Brian Eno on production is definitely missed here, that's for sure. And all adds up to songs that might sound pretty, at least at first glance, but lack momentum or presence thanks to the lumpy bass tone and the really stiff percussion. Johnny Buckland remains the standout musician of the group for his guitar melodies, I must say that, that. But even he can't do much with this album's composition. He's not willing to drive drama forward or add more powerful emotions. It's very telling that the most incongruous moment of this album, the EDM-inspired production on A Sky Full of Stars by Avicii, yet has the most energy and power of this entire record, which actually lends it some real emotional weight, and that's saying something. Now, granted, I get the feeling that more hazy style was part of the point, as Chris Martin has said in interviews discussing the album's themes surrounding how to deal with one's past, good and bad, like describing them in the terms of ghost stories. They're hazy, they're insubstantial. And given that this album is characterized by troubled relationships, many people are calling this album a breakup album. But if that's true, and I'm inclined to believe that it is, I'm not convinced that this is a good breakup album. I will give Coldplay credit for articulating some degree of nuance across several songs. I like the insecurity and desperation in True Love. I like the bitterness in Another's Arms, and I like the fact that the narrator finally lets go in the album closer track, Oh. Now, there is something of an arc here, which is, it kind of works on a bit of a rough level, but here's where we run into the first of two big problems with this album, the first being the songwriting. Speaking as a Coldplay fan, they aren't subtle songwriters, but honestly, that's one of the reasons I've always liked them. They can go for broke and sell that sort of simple songwriting that has made them such an accessible and yet emotionally compelling act. But on this sort of breakup album that's all dealt in subtle shades and requires nuance with complicated emotions and undercurrents to this, it demands more subtlety than this. And thus Coldplay's broadly sketched lyrics that tend to float more in extremes of black and white, they come across as reductive. And on top of the fact that the poetry is nothing all that stellar, the picture here presents it lacks a lot of dimension. We get plenty of shots of Chris Martin's wistful sadness and loneliness, but not a lot else. And in comparison with Beck's Morning Phase, the other moody record that focused on getting over the past and namely breakups, Ghost Stories just falls painfully short when it comes to good songwriting material. Now granted, I can't entirely blame the songwriting, which takes us to the second big problem, Chris Martin's vocal delivery. And you know, I won't deny there are moments where he's an effective emotional presence behind the microphone. I'm not going to take that away from him. And I don't doubt that he has some range in being able to express some of these songs on an emotional level. But you know what? Maybe his falsetto is just weakening with age, because man, it's nowhere near what it's been on previous albums. And you can tell that the vocal production is doing whatever it can to prop up his voice, but it really does sound shaky, and not in a good way. I'm guessing part of it came from Martin's desire to sing more quietly and intimately, but you need an incredible voice and incredible control of your voice to pull off falsetto like that. I don't have that control, and really, the only artist off the top of my head who does is maybe Rye. But in comparison with that, Chris Martin's voice is just not as powerful in this setting, in this range anymore. And while I won't deny that his muted, understated performance might fit the attempted tone of the songwriting, the actual content, which is much more black and white and much more broad, just doesn't match that level of nuance or empathetic delivery. It tends to be minimalist, but when you focus tighter on his lyrics, there just isn't much there, and his delivery doesn't do much to back it up. In other words, I don't get a sense of real drama from this album. It doesn't have emotional weight with me. That means I find it really, really hard to get invested in it, and that's the big problem. But in the end, Ghost Stories by Coldplay is okay, I guess. It passes the time, it's not going to offend anybody, but it does cement in my mind a suspicion I've had since Milo Xyloto, is that Coldplay is a little bit too concerned with being considering as relevant in music. They're always going to make music that's recognizably their sound, their own, but if there's a sound that's hot and attractive in mainstream music, they're gonna use it in some way. Right now, stripped down ambient indie rock and EDM are more popular than usual, and it's no surprise that Coldplay incorporate elements of both of that into this record to make it as accessible and, let's call it, timely as possible. And with elements like that, and the fact that I'm not sold on the emotional weight in the songwriting or in the delivery, it makes this album really come across as kind of calculated to me, and that's never a good feeling when it comes to this sort of record that should spring from a real emotional place. Now that said, there are moments that I did like outshine the moments that I didn't, so I'm giving this album a light 6 out of 10, but you know what? As a Coldplay fan, these guys, they can do a lot better, and I can't say that I'm not disappointed with this. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at from this year, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.